Now we talk about personal data and politics, something that is, I know that is of concern to many think tanks and to many think tankers, and to many of you connected here today. And so I'm gonna step back. You won't see me for about 20 minutes or so, and I will leave you with Varoon from Tactical Tech, who will be leading this first keynote session of today. Thank you, Varoon.
Thank you so much, Enrique. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks so much for having me as well. I assume everyone's able to hear me, but if not, I think probably just holler in the chat and someone will stop me. But I think we can just go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for the invitation. I just like to acknowledge my team, whom I'm here representing. We are part of an NGO in Berlin called Tactical Tech. And I'd also like to acknowledge a number of the partners we've worked with over the course of about 3 years doing this research. We have worked with a number of think tanks, technologists, technology researchers, journalists, civil society organizations, academics, lawyers, now over about 36 countries. And the ones listed here are those countries in which we've worked with a local partner on understanding in a bit more depth how personal data was being used for political purposes in these respective countries. And of course, if any of you are interested in working with us, by all means, feel free to reach out. My contact information is on the last slide. I just want to give a brief overview of the talk. I'll keep it to about 20 minutes, and we'll start with some very lightweight and fast-paced overview of some of our findings over the last few years. Then we'll proceed to some reflections on basically why I think all of this matters and why we should all care. And finally, we'll take some questions at the end. First, I want to say that this is not a talk about disinformation or misinformation. Obviously, this is a big and important topic. But from the very beginning of studying this issue, my colleagues and I felt that even in the absence of any nefarious agendas or ill intention, even without wanting to sow misinformation on the internet, just considering the tech products and services that operate openly and on the market, that are celebrated often by the companies that make them, just considering those alone, we felt that there was reason to be concerned about the integrity of our democratic processes. And so far, the disinformation campaigns that we've observed have not leveraged personal data to the extent that the techniques we're about to talk about do. I have to say that my personal fear is when the world of dis and misinformation converges with the world of data-rich, personalized information, and propaganda becomes something that's personalized to each of us based on our personal data footprint. But for the time being, these worlds have remained relatively independent from one another. And with that, I want to start with a quote from David Gurwitz. He wrote in 2015 this paragraph, which I'll read in a second, but I like it because it, I think, very aptly encapsulates the scale and the scope of the kinds of personal data we talk about when we talk about personal data in the service of political influence. He wrote, "What you buy, what you read, what you share online, who you associate with, what your mood is, where you work, what you do, what your health situation is, where you've donated, what clothing styles you like, what car models you buy, your favorite cola brand, your favorite phone brand, all of that information is available to those with the budget to buy it and the algorithms to aggregate and sift through it. This is where big data is changing the face of American election politics." Voter data is readily available on the market, not just in the US, but around the world. This is a screenshot from a company called L2. They are a US-based firm. And here they are showing their 190 million voter records. Now, you might be wondering what kind of voter records they have. Together with a partner called Haystack DNA, they have come up with predictions for all American voters on their stances towards a number of issues. And this just shows a couple of them. It shows individual voter level predictions for issues like gay marriage or casinos, attitudes towards Black Lives Matter, the death penalty. These are very sensitive political matters, and these are for-profit companies that have developed statistical algorithms to predict where individual voters fall on a scale from 0 to 100 in supporting each of these issues. Here's another company called Aristotle. They are also a US-based company. Here they're showing from their homepage, from the top half of the screen, the political data that they offer And the bottom half of the screen was from a blog post of theirs. As you can see, they wrote, a 204 million person voter file just got even more precise with modeling capabilities. So you might be wondering what campaigns do with this kinds of information. Well, they do a lot with this, and we'll just be talking about a few of the kinds of technologies involved in actually leveraging and collecting voter data. One of the most common things that political campaigns do is they run experiments. They are interested in what voters are responding to. In the industry, this is called A/B testing. Here you can see 3 ads from the Modi campaign in India. At first glance, they look identical, but if you actually look more closely, you'll see that the text from the ads are different. The Modi campaign here is running an experiment to see which copy is generating the most engagement for them. The Bernie campaign did something very similar. Here they have with 3 different birthday cards, and they are testing which image, the old school Bernie, the black and white image, or the more modern recent color photos, which one does a better job of getting more people to sign Bernie's birthday card. Ben Carson's presidential bid did the same thing on his website. Which headline was more effective in getting people to give their information over and to sign up? The Obama-Biden campaign did this back in 2012. They realized that when they sequenced their fundraising flow, doing it sequentially resulted in 5% more fundraising dollars brought in. And this can really be done on steroids. Here you can see 2 banners the Trump campaign tested, and the top one, the one outlined in green, was the one that was more effective. A/B testing is really just mass testing of messaging, design, or other communication elements that are used to drive a desired output. That output could be clicks, could be donations, they could be signups to a newsletter, or signups from voters who are willing to volunteer their time. And this quote from Gary Kobe, which I'll read next, I think expresses how a system of A/B testing can really be conducted at scale and mass. In 2016, where he's quoted here by Izzy Lepowski in Wired, he was the director of digital advertising and fundraising for the Trump campaign. He is now the Trump 2020 digital director. He said at the time, back in 2016, on any given day, Kobe says, this was reported in Wired, the campaign was running 40,000 to 50,000 variants of its ads. On the day of the 3rd presidential debate in October, the team ran 175,000 variants. Kobe calls this approach A/B testing on steroids. I used to run an A/B testing team at a Silicon Valley company, and I have to say that this scale, this volume of testing is truly unprecedented. Another thing campaigns do is that they are involved in, they're interested in what voters do online. And this has a lot to do with the very systemic infrastructure of online advertising and third-party tracking. A lot of people don't know this, but when you go to a website, let's say adidas.com, it's more than just Adidas that may be able to register your visit to the website. There are a whole host of third-party companies, which is why it's called third-party tracking, that may be able to register that you visited the Adidas website. So let's take a very common one like Google Analytics. Google might register that you visited the Adidas site in the morning, and let's say in the afternoon you visited your local Symphony's website, for example. Google Analytics could register your visit to that website as well. And by monitoring and collecting data like this over time, these advertisers can develop a very intimate understanding of your interests and hobbies and values by tracking you from one website to another and monitoring your online behaviors. The slide that you see here was a confidential slide that was from the political ad targeting company called Campaign Grid. It was accidentally uploaded to their website. And this slide is poking fun at internet anonymity. The comic on the left from 1993 says, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. But in 2011, there's actually a lot of information that you can ascertain about the dog surfing the internet, like the fact that he's between the ages of 50 and 54. He lives in Pennsylvania's 13th congressional district. You'll notice the title of the slide was Internet Users Are No Longer Anonymous. Another leaked slide, this one from Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential bid, expresses a very similar sentiment. You can read any of these bullet points to understand the invasiveness of this online tracking. The third one, for example, says, we are constantly targeting the person, not the site, not the device. The one right above that reads, we have a truly cross-channel, cross-browser effort that allows us to serve an ad to a target of ours on their desktop at work and then to their iPad as they watch TV at night. This is really quite an invasive system of online tracking, and that is absolutely a source of information that political campaigns are interested. One of the things that they do is, of course, serve ads and efforts to influence people. So, of course, understanding what voters do online is of prime interest to them. Another big source of data and big topic of interest is where voters are. We call this geotargeting. The image on the left is a screenshot from Field Team 6. It's a Democratic voter registration outfit, and it's been in the news lately a lot because it has enlisted geotargeting capabilities in targeting voters who were attending Black Lives Matter protests. That, as you can imagine, is quite invasive. You would imagine your average protester isn't aware that there are geotargeting technologies being deployed to harvest their data to get them, in this case, to register to vote for Democratic candidates. But that infrastructure very much exists. And in this case, it's being used by progressives and celebrated for its effectiveness. In fact, the founder of Field Team 6, a guy named Jason Berlin, said of the technology, "It's deeply spooky, but extremely helpful." I want to talk briefly about another kind of geotargeting. This sub-technology of geotargeting is called geofencing. Geofencing is a technology in which you can cast a virtual perimeter. So if there's a point of interest, you can draw a virtual perimeter around it and send selective messaging only to those individuals in that perimeter. Ted Cruz, for example, geofenced the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. Perhaps some of you have been there. He geofenced the Venetian Hotel precisely during the time in 2015, during his presidential bid, during the Republican National Jewish Coalition. So at the time of the conference, attendees were seeing pro-Israeli advertising Ted Cruz's pro-Israeli stances during the course of the conference. And I think this is also interesting because conference attendees probably were not aware that Ted Cruz's campaign has enlisted a geofencing technology to target attendees of the Republican National Jewish Coalition so Ted Cruz can promote his pro-Israeli stances to them precisely at that building, precisely during the time of that conference. And there's been a lot of talk recently among more progressive circles among deploying geofencing more aggressively to target protesters attending Black Lives Matter protests to advance democratic causes. I want to close with one story. This is a screenshot from a video uploaded by the campaign of Dr. Cahuenga, the individual shown here. This image is a still from that video that his campaign released a few weeks before his election. He is in this photo visiting a tattoo parlor. And what's interesting about it is that he's visiting this tattoo parlor not because he wanted to get a tattoo and not because he wanted to give someone else a tattoo and not because he really had a genuine interest in meeting the people at the tattoo parlor. He went to this tattoo parlor because the digital listening firm that was advising him made a list of activities for him to do. And the one that they deemed would generate the most buzz online was if he were to visit a tattoo parlor. And this is the homepage of that company called Autopolitik. They work extensively in political campaigns across Southeast Asia. And as you can see from their headline, they advertise winning elections with social intelligence. This is really just the tip of the iceberg. The use of the technologies involved in using personal data are far more extensive. Mobile apps, these are official campaign apps that candidates are increasingly releasing, have been documented to hoover up users' personal data very aggressively for political purposes, political bots. Voter data has routinely been leaked, breached, and hacked. Robocalls, which perhaps some of you have been plagued by, are also being enlisted for political purposes. The world of Internet of Things devices, these are basically internet-connected devices like smart TVs, smart fridges, smart toasters, smart beds. These are all technologies that collect some of our most intimate behavioral data, and this information is now starting to be leveraged for explicitly political purposes. And of course, in the aftermath of Cambridge Analytica, personality profiling as well has become a big topic of discussion and something that other companies around the world have started to emulate. A lot of individuals, including people at think tanks and journalists, when they are shown this whole body of evidence, not just the few examples that we looked at here, but really when they see the whole collection of evidence demonstrating and illustrating the ways in which personal data is being used for political influence, they often ask, well, does it work? And, Cambridge Analytica happened, but what's the next big scandal? And I think the response to this is my personal response to this is very aptly captured by the way Edward Snowden talks about the way people responded to his revelations about mass surveillance. He wrote in his book, Permanent Record, in mid-2012, I was just trying to get a handle on how mass surveillance actually worked. Almost every journalist who later reported on the disclosures was primarily concerned with the targets of surveillance. That is to say, they were more interested in the topics of the surveillance reports than in the system that produced them. And I think for us to tackle this issue of the use of our personal data for political purposes, we have to be sure to focus on the system that produced them and not get caught up with merely the topics of surveillance. The fact of the matter is that this is a huge industry. Cambridge Analytica is not an isolated example. You see here the screenshots of just a small subset of companies that my colleagues and I identified that use personal data in the service of political influence in some way, shape, or form. It's precisely for this reason that we've decided to call this industry the influence industry. These are all companies that have, in some capacity, leveraged our personal data for political influence. Our personal data has become a political asset. It's become a means for political intelligence and also an instrument for political influence. As a data scientist or a statistician, I like to think of this more in terms of a data pipeline. At the bottom level, you have this question of acquisition. Where are you getting your data? Well, companies like L2 that we looked at earlier have it readily available if you're willing to pay the price. Then what can you learn from your data? How can you analyze it? Running things like experiments, A/B testing allow you to understand what sorts of messaging voters are responding to and what messaging voters are not responding to. And finally, how do you use this information and how do you actually apply it? How do you use it for influence? Of course, you can use it to disseminate ads to voters to ultimately try to influence the way that they vote. The fact of the matter is that the exact same technologies that are being used to sell us things like shoes or smoothies or plane tickets or lifestyles or insert any good or service that you wish here, those exact same technologies are being used to sell us political leaders. And I think that's deeply problematic because those are, of course, very different things with very different implications. And oftentimes, these tools are celebrated for the efficiency gains they offer. And I think it's a testament to this phenomenon that political campaigns are optimizing towards metrics and not necessarily towards matters of moral clarity or leadership. I think it's important to note here that all sides of the political spectrum are complicit. This is not an issue of just one side of the political spectrum. And largely speaking, our legal interventions to tackle these issues have been ill-equipped. It's not just that the law has been slow, but when laws are passed, they're vulnerable to technological circumvention by tech companies who are able to move much faster. And more generally, I think there's been very much an overfocus on Facebook. A lot of policy discussions have devolved into issues exclusively, how do we monitor Facebook? I haven't mentioned Facebook once this whole presentation, I think. And they've over-focused on micro-targeting. As with issues of geotargeting and A/B testing, there's a lot that you can learn about someone that's of political value that has nothing to do with putting an ad in front of them. In the context of geotargeting, for example, simply knowing where someone is says a lot about what they value. Do they shop at an organic grocery store? If they do, maybe they have more environmentally inclined views. Do they go to a gay bar on a Friday night? If so, that probably says something about their attitudes towards LGBT issues. Similarly, A/B testing gives you a sense for what voters respond to and what they don't respond to. And this can all be done covertly without a voter even seeing a kind of a proactive political intervention or ad that you put in front of them. I think this vision of the internet as a democratizing force has largely failed to come to fruition because really big tech has come to reinforce traditional power structures. Big tech is now a natural extension of the same infrastructure and politics behind big oil and big finance. And the data industrial complex that has come to characterize big tech is very similar to the logics of big industries we've seen in the past. I think the way in which oil companies, for example, privatize assets but pollute the environment and externalize that cost onto the public is very analogous to the manner in which tech companies privatize the assets of creating spaces for political campaigns to run 365 days a year. Nowadays, there is no such thing as a campaign cycle. It's happening every day of the year online. They privatize those assets, that engagement, that click, that time spent online. But the cost of those dynamics, the ways in which they undermine our democratic foundations and principles and foster, or rather erode, a common understanding of facts, that democratic cost is shouldered by us, the public. So I think this idea of an environmental externality is very analogous to what we should be talking about more of, the idea of a democratic externality. And in the time of pandemics, these issues are going to become even more important. Governments and private companies have further justification for increased oversight of the public. And the whole world of online campaigning is only simply going to intensify as meeting in person becomes more and more risky. And I think it's worth just taking a step back and perhaps if infrastructures of technological disruption that have transformed manufacturing and health and transit and farming and education and travel and dating, if those have created a system of surveillance capitalism in which all of our clicks and scrolls and hovers and page loads and articles that we read or don't read, if technological disruption of all those industries has fostered a sort of surveillance capitalist outcome, then perhaps technological disruption of politics has laid the groundwork for surveillance politics. And I think this is extremely important because politics is, of course, a leverage issue. Whether it's the environment or labor rights or human rights or holding power to account or defending the space to dissent, whatever it is, all those things become so much harder when we have a surveillance political state or when surveillance politics thrive. And I want to close with this quote from Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud. He wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country." Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Varoon. That was really great. And we have questions, but as I mentioned in the chat, we're not going to get through all the questions as is the case in these keynotes, but we're going to join Varoon in Coffee Room 1 after we're done with this broadcast. So if you want to have a face-to-face, a more fluid conversation with Varoon, please join us there in a bit. I'll let you know. I think a question that has been running through the chat has to do with can this be used for good, or are think tanks with let's say a more altruistic objective, or are NGOs sort of trying to save the planet? Are they using these technologies as well? I mean, certainly A/B testing in communications is being used, right? We test the impact that a Facebook post will have, but what about these other more sophisticated technologies that you discussed?
Absolutely. One of the reasons I'm sure many of you are aware that in recent months, Twitter, for example, has come out and decided to ban political ads. Interestingly, one of the sources of backlash to that was this idea that perhaps these technologies have democratic benefits, and by banning political ads, we are undermining those benefits for sure. I think, I think the point here is that there are potential democratic benefits. I think it all matters in how these technologies are deployed. I think one of the big problems right now is that there's a huge informational asymmetry among internet users or members of the public, and among those developing and wielding these technologies for their own purposes. I think it would be too much to say that there are no democratic benefits from doing this, but I think it all depends on how it's used and how they're how they're wielded or deployed. But more generally, I think, nowadays, when you ask a company, for example, often for-profit companies are unwilling to be very transparent about the ways in which they are using these technologies. I think there is a way in which you can imagine deploying some of these in democratically beneficial ways, like getting people to register to vote, increasing democratic participation. But when the ways in which those technologies are deployed remain opaque, that's a problem. Our democracy, elections should be contested on the basis of ideas, not who has the better micro-targeting strategy. And when these technologies are going to be deployed in opaque ways that are not open to public scrutiny or questioning, I think that's problematic and very quickly calls into question the democratic benefits that they may otherwise be able to afford us.
Great. So that makes me think of, we always say that the way that think tanks try to bring about influence also matters, right? So if they choose a path that is closed, that is opaque, that is private, that it's not transparent, they're not necessarily contributing to building the institutions that they supposedly wanted to see in their societies. So thank you very much. These, as I've always said, these keynotes are meant to get us thinking about something. And what I want to do is I want to invite people to have a conversation with you in coffee room 1. All right. Thank you very much, Varoon. It was a pleasure having you here, and I look forward to meeting you in person next time we're in Berlin.
Likewise, yes. Thank you so much, and I'll see you over in coffee room 1.
Bye-bye.
Cool. Cheers.